as I prepared my presentation, I'm reminded that, and as Celine mentioned earlier, I retired quite a few years ago, and the little hair that I have left, I think I would have lost it if I hadn't retired. And you will well understand as I go through my presentation how difficult the situation is in many of our educational institutions. I do mention, and the topic is around Anglophone CEGEPs, but I think it's important to mention, and my colleague Professor Storr is with us, McGill, and other educators from the vocational centers in Quebec, that all education, our entire system went through a real change in the last couple of years. So I'm talking about the CEGEPs, but I'm always keeping in mind that all the institutions went through a difficult time. Donc, merci. Je vais faire ma présentation en anglais, mais
So I'll make my presentation in English, but of course I'm available to answer questions in English or in French.
so the next slide. Thank you, Nancy. I think that the most important thing, and I think we tend to have forgotten already what went on during COVID, and I remind myself that we weren't even allowed out of the house, and maybe in 5-10 years when we tell our children, our grandchildren, what we went through, they may laugh and say, no, this is technically impossible. I mean, the government wasn't telling you when you could leave the house. Yes, and they were even telling you could maybe leave it if you had a dog, and that made it a little easier. So we tend to forget, and I think the first thing I'd say is that traditionally CEGEPs were very limited with online courses. It was really not part of what CEGEPs did. The idea was CEGEPs were smaller classes, maximum 30-35 students, and the students got to know their teachers, and that was always the idea that it was a stepping stone to university, where the classes were bigger, and that they could have classes with 300 students. So the idea that really in the space of days, the CEGEPs were forced to proceed totally online was a major upheaval. And some people called it bricolage dans l'urgence. And the teachers, the administrators, the professionals, they all had to change their complete way of seeing education, seeing teaching. And again, because CEGEPs were smaller, and students knew that if there's something they didn't understand in class, they could just walk to the teacher's office and sit down and chat and talk about what went on in the class, but also just have a nice conversation and have build a relationship with their teacher. This hit me, I guess, a few months ago when a student asked me, and as I said, I retired quite a few years ago, asked me if I could write a letter of recommendation. Now, again, because I had retired, I didn't know the student that well. I met her on activities in the community, but not in an academic platform. And in talking to the student, I said, well, what about, I'd be happy to write your letter, but what about your teachers? And I mean, her answer was she didn't really know her teachers. Now, she was a graduating student. And I said, well, you don't know your teachers, but for the student, online was not necessarily getting to know their teacher. So that's just one example of what these adolescents were going through. The next point: students who desperately needed this in-person support were now alone at home on a computer, again, without any real preparation. They didn't have that preparation in high school. They certainly didn't have it in CEGEP. Some of the students coming from out of the region, so if they were studying in Montreal, they were coming in from Gaspé or from lower North Shore or from some Outaouais. Same thing with the student coming into Quebec City. So in very short period of time, the students had to adapt to some of the changes. The next point, again, we forget that not everybody had the computer hardware that we just assume. And the proof of that is in our CEGEPs, the computer labs are always full. Now, if everyone had their own little laptop, they'd be in the cafeteria working on their stuff. But the labs are always full, and of course, with extended hours. So now the students not only had to work with this all their online classes, but they also had to compete with their mom and dad or brothers and sisters for the one computer that they had at home. There's also another phenomenon. There was an increase in the number of students abandoning their courses. And again, what we really saw was the exceptionally high rates of incomplete courses. Now, an incomplete course at the CEGEP, and that hasn't changed since the time I retired. A student had to have a very good reason, because the incomplete does not come with a grade. It's marked on your report card that you have an INC, an incomplete, but with no grade. And therefore, if you're students that are worried about their R score to get into some competitive programs at the university, we're not hindered with an INC. But you needed to have a very, very good reason to get an incomplete. You couldn't just simply say, "Oh, I decided not to go to my class anymore, so I want an incomplete." But now with COVID, the government said we will enable students to get an incomplete based on the difficulties they're running through with online courses and COVID. Now, it's fine to say that, but when a student gets an incomplete, they still have to make that course up. And I think that again just meant that students were going to be taking a lot more time to finish their diploma, simply because they had to get incomplete courses that, in the long run, they still had to take over. There's an increased demand for counseling, psychological support. And that we've seen in all our CEGEPs. Now, the government did help the CEGEPs and did give extra funding. In some cases, at the CEGEP level, I think it was about $65 million. So the money was made available, and certainly that was necessary. But again, a change in the way we did things, because the students were not on campus. The building was closed. So it became difficult. And the CEGEPs also suffered from the inability to find psychological professionals and counseling professionals, again, making it difficult for the students. La Fédération des CEGEPs said that one of the major impacts was students were losing their basic study skills. And again, the way things had changed with COVID, students were having a real difficult time taking charge of themselves and making sure that what had to be done on a certain period of time would be done. Now, of course, the teachers did everything they could in extending deadlines for the students. Some of the CEGEPs, I know, for example, I see my colleague Joanne Ross is here from John Abbott. Even their way of counseling. Earlier, someone mentioned the one interview sessions for counseling. And again, that's one way to get to see as many students as possible in a limited time because of limited enrollment. Now, when we look at specifically at students that are in some of our health and social service program, I think it is different in a student in a general education program. There are challenges, but their programs have some flexibility and do, in fact, have some periods where they can make up the time. In the case of students in our professional program, so that's nursing, dental health, social work technology, respiratory technology, their programs start like 8:30 in the morning, and they typically go right to the end of the day. There's very, very few empty slots. And when I would work on scheduling, I would look at the schedules of some of these technology students, and I'd say, I just don't know how they do it. And some of them, in addition to that, would be part of a athletic team, or would have a part-time job. So again, they're very, very difficult for these students to make up lost courses. And then again, the course they had to abandon may not be offered every semester. So it became more and more difficult for the students in our health and social service programs. The other interesting thing is, as many of you may know, many of the internships were canceled. We had programs, for example, at Dialogue McGill with Vanier College was sending students to northern Quebec. Well, those students weren't allowed to travel. So a lot of the internships that for many students in the career path, it's the most positive part of their education. They may not be that excited about their philosophy course, but the idea of going into hospital or center, CLSC or whatever, was exciting, and it also gave them a better idea of whether they were in the right career path. And in most cases, it was a time for them to appreciate who they were and what they could do for society. To me, this is the next slide. To me, this is the thing that I gave a lot of thought to. All of us remember this, or a version of this photo. Nurse just finishing her shift. I mean, really, her face is injured by having to wear the mask all day. And this is what our students were seeing more than ever. I mean, they were seeing the I think the suffering of our healthcare professionals. A study in the United States at Harvard said that one of the things that was clear was there was unbearable suffering. And this is what our students were seeing, our potential students, our high school students saying, well, what am I going to do with my life and my career? And this is what they were seeing day in and day out. And as just citizens, we were suffering with these workers. And we were supporting the workers. However, the students were seeing these healthcare workers being interviewed and saying how tough it was to, in fact, use their own phone to phone up family of patients that the member had just passed away, and they were using their own telephones to do that. Healthcare workers said that they hadn't been home for 2 days because they couldn't leave because of the lack of personnel. So this is what I think probably the greatest impact of COVID was. How do we, get students to reconsider a profession where, as I said, where some people said was full of unbearable suffering, and that's a challenge we have. And I think the next slide, Nancy. What are we going to do now? The CEGEPs have to, and I'm sure they will, and I know that some are. I know, for example, my colleagues of John Abbott have mentioned this to me. How can we recruit students? And in spite of everything, I mean, the photo that I just showed, there are still some feel-good stories. There's still some people that say, it was tough, but it reminded me of why I had chosen the profession, why I had chosen a health or social service profession. And I mentioned here the health heroes during COVID. And I think we have those, and we still have people that went through this difficult time, but at the end of the day said, I realized more than ever how important my work was. Like, we know now that hospitals had to close because they didn't have the workers. So it's clear that our health care professionals are vital, and I think they know that more than ever. So as institutions, we have to go out recruiting students and remind them, in a sense, of the importance of their work. And I mentioned here nursing, but it's really in all health-related fields. One of the things that has happened after COVID is that the CEGEPs, and again, they give hybrid, they have hybrid delivery of courses. And that can be very helpful. It can be very good that those students can be on on campus, and this can help families, men or women that have responsibilities at home. It helps them, in fact, to maybe get through the program. So that is certainly a positive part. Online supervision. So the CEGEPs have become experts in a sense, have their students doing an internship in Blanc-Sablon and being supervised online. This was almost impossible in the past. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing that possibility, which is wonderful, because sometimes just the thought of sending a student to a northern community is expensive in itself, but to also imagine sending a supervisor to a northern community would be almost impossible. So this is certainly a very positive thing, and that's in the area, as I said, it can be nursing, and we do it in dental hygiene through at John Abbott and other programs. The mental health support to students is continuing, even if, in fact, this maybe the funding is not as great, but there's still funding, and there's a lot of energy to put into supporting students and staff with mental health support. So I think that's really important. I mean, my last point on this slide is that the work that we do at Dialogue McGill certainly is something that will help and can help. And I encourage all of you to look at the program. Jacqueline's presentation earlier just gave a very good summary of some of the things we do, and certainly that is worthwhile if you have a chance to look at our website and maybe at the short video that Jacqueline produced. Next slide. Now, this is where probably some of my colleagues are all shaking to see what I'm going to say. I think earlier, two of our presenters, in fact, talked about Bill 96, and I'm going to talk about it as far as the Anglophone CEGEPs are concerned. And as I said, it's a very difficult time now for CEGEPs. For Anglophone CEGEPs, it becomes a little more difficult to get the year going. First thing I say, some of the major changes, and don't forget Law 14 is part of is the language part of 96. And really, if we remember Bill 101, many politicians have said Bill 101 should be extended to CEGEP. Now, I think it's fair to say that if Bill 101 was placed in the CEGEP system, many of the CEGEPs would have to close. That is a reality. So Law 14 is a law that in fact gives opportunities for Francophones to continue studying in English, but has some restrictions. So unlike the Francophone CEGEPs, Anglophone CEGEPs have had to really spend a whole year preparing for the changes imposed by Bill 96 and Law 14. And clearly all this director generals that I've worked with have mentioned that even before this year started, the staff, professionals, and teachers are almost exhausted because they had to redo many, and probably most of their programs because of Bill 96. Next slide, Nancy. So here are the major changes, and I'm really going to try to do this quickly. There are now two categories of students going to CEGEPs. This was never an issue. So the two categories of students are les ayants droit et les non ayants droit. So an ayant droit, so one who's permitted, the students have the certificate of admissibility for English education. So earlier, as was mentioned, students that one of their parents went to English schools in Canada. The students that were educated in Quebec, in the province of Quebec, in English. So those are the people that have that special certificate. So that's the ayant droit. Now again, we never had ayant droits, and students just applied to CEGEP and were accepted or refused, whatever. Now les non ayant droit, these are typically our Francophone students, the Bill 101 students, allophone. who do not have a right to English education. So from now on, the non-ayant droit students will have to complete a nice, there's a mistake there, typo, l'épreuve uniforme de français. So again, these students that came to that do not have the right to English education are allowed, will be permitted to come to the English CEGEP, but they'll have to write the French exit exam, which they didn't have to do before. Because when they were in English CEGEP, they did the English exit exam, not the French exit exam. To prepare for this exam, students will be required to complete 3 courses en français langue commune. These are, again, les non-ayants droit. So they will have to take additional 3 French courses to be able to prepare for the épreuve uniforme de français. So this, again, imagine we have a typical program for a student, all students. Now all of a sudden we have a difference. We have students that have a certificate and students that don't have a certificate. The ones that don't have a certificate, they're going to have to take the French exit exam, not the English exit exam, the French exit exam. Next slide. So there's three other measures, Law 14. Priority to students ayant droit. Again, CEGEPs, student would apply. They wouldn't look at where the student came from, or if the student had their certificate. They, in fact, didn't even know. Now, priority will be given to students that have the certificate, donc les ayants droit. That's number 1. The next phase is CEGEPs now have a maximum number of students. There's a maximum number of students in the Anglophone CEGEPs. So the government said you cannot, again, provincially, you cannot go over 17%. 17% of the students in Quebec were in Anglophone CEGEPs. We cannot make that 18%. We can't make it 19%. It cannot go over that 17%. So in other words, the Anglophone CEGEPs cannot grow. They have to stay at the registrations they're at now. The third point is if the CEGEPs go over this very specific number, then they're fined. They get a fine. The fine is depending on the program, but let's say just round figure, $7,000 to $8,000. So imagine when you're a CEGEP administrator has to guess. In fact, and I'll give nursing as an example, but it's all the programs, not just one. They have to guess how many students are going to come to the CEGEP with their quotas. So they say, if I accept, if my quota is 1,000, I accept 1,200. I'm accepting that, thinking that at least 200 will not come to my CEGEP, may go to a French CEGEP or go to another English CEGEP, but they won't come to my CEGEP. So, but what happens if my maximum is 1,000, yet I get 1,020 that come? Well, 20 times 7 is $140,000 that I will have to pay in fines as a CEGEP. So you can imagine what it means now for CEGEPs. They just don't want to go exceed the quota. They've got to be very careful. Also, if there was for example, if there was an unbelievable need, and we know there's a need for health professionals right now, if the CEGEP said, I would like to, instead of taking 30 students in nursing, I'd like to take 60. Well, that's fine. You can do that, but you have to reduce another program by 30. If you reduce another program by 30, then these are teachers that have job security, and you would have to let them go. So you can just imagine, this is a very simple example of the pressures that the CEGEPs are now having to live under. Now the students ayant droit, so that's let's say we'll call them the certificate students, they will have to take 3 new French courses, in addition to the French courses they're presently required to take. Now that may take different forms, maybe in dental health, maybe one of the courses will be given in French. But again, do we have the teachers to be able to give a course in French in a very specific area? We may, we may not. Or some students may take courses as complementary courses, French courses. Well, that's fine. But again, if many of our students used to take Spanish and German as complementary courses. They'll take French. Well, what happens to those French and German teachers? Well, I guess they will be asked. They will have to leave. So you again just imagine the headaches as we're going through. So there you go. I just wanted to expose you in as objective way as I could that there are these major challenges, and we're in a situation where we need we need our graduates. We need to do everything we can to keep our graduates in Quebec, but also to in fact interest them in careers in the health and social services. So the 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 one thing, hopefully, and this is I'm sure some of my colleagues might hit me over the head with on this, but if in fact our students are taking more courses, then maybe it will make them more comfortable or um, potentially confident to work in our health system here in Quebec.